The courtroom smelled like old wood and expensive perfume. Not the clean kind, the kind that announced itself before the person wearing it ever spoke. Amber Thornton sat at the defendant's table with her legs crossed, like she had all day, like this was a brunch reservation that ran late, not a probate trial where 3 people were begging a judge to undo a will. She was 34. A designer black dress hugged her like it had been tailored to win arguments. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves that didn't move even when she shifted. Her makeup was flawless, foundation like porcelain, lips like a quiet threat. And she didn't just look expensive, she looked untouchable, like she belonged on a yacht in Monaco, not in a probate courtroom in Philadelphia. Across the aisle sat 3 people who looked like life had taken turns hitting them in the mouth. Robert Thornton Jr., 68, gray hair combed back in a way that couldn't hide how tired he was, a department store suit that was clean but outdated, hands that still looked like they remembered steel mills, calloused, rough, honest. Patricia, 65, silver hair pulled back into a simple bun, navy dress, modest and worn at the seams. Her purse sat in her lap, both hands gripping it like she was afraid if she let go, something inside her would spill out. And Michael, 62, thinning hair and a tie slightly crooked, like he'd dressed in the dark. He kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of a folded tissue he hadn't used yet, the kind of habit people develop when they're trying not to shake. They were the children of James Thornton, billionaire, industrialist, self-made legend, dead 4 months, married to Amber for 18 months before that. And the math sat in the air like a stink no one could pretend wasn't there. 90-year-old man, 32-year-old bride. The tabloids had chewed it to the bone. May-December romance or gold-digging scheme? Billionaire's bombshell bride, love or larceny? She called it love, his kids call it theft. Today, those headlines weren't just in magazines, they were in faces. Reporters filled the back rows, notepads ready, pens poised like knives. A few people from the city's high society sat scattered in the gallery, dressed quietly expensive, leaning toward each other in whispers that didn't try very hard to be quiet. Amber heard it. She didn't react. That was the cruel part. It wasn't that she didn't know, it was that she didn't care. A man in the gallery leaned forward to his wife and murmured just loud enough to be heard, "Kids always show up when the money's on the table." A soft chuckle answered him. Patricia's shoulders tightened. Robert stared straight ahead like if he turned he might explode. Michael's face dipped toward the table, like the courtroom had suddenly gotten too bright. Amber's attorney, Marcus Pemberton, sat beside her in an Armani suit that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle in its life. Silver hair, easy smile, the kind of man who could insult you using perfect manners, then ask if you needed water. He leaned toward Amber and whispered something. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her entire posture was the smile. At the plaintiff's table, Helen Vasquez, sharp-eyed, older, precise, arranged her folders like a surgeon setting instruments. She didn't glance at Amber even once, not yet. Because the first humiliation wasn't going to come from Helen. The first humiliation was already happening. It was the room. It was the way people looked at the children like they were the ones doing something ugly. Then the side door opened. Judge Philip Hargrove entered. 73, silver hair, a face carved by 4 decades of lies, schemes, and people who thought they could outsmart a bench. All rise. The room stood. Amber rose smoothly, unhurried, elegant, like the courtroom had been built for her to walk through. The Thornton children stood too, but it looked different, like effort, like age, like grief. Judge Hargrove sat. The room sat. He opened the file in front of him. Thick, very thick. He read for a long moment, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable. Somewhere in the back, a phone vibrated. The bailiff's stare ended it immediately. Judge Hargrove looked up. His eyes went to Amber first. Amber met his gaze without blinking. Then the judge looked at the Thornton children. Robert sat rigid. Patricia dabbed at her eyes even though no tears fell, like she'd been practicing the motion for 8 months. Michael stared at the table, jaw clenched, as if he didn't trust his face to stay calm. "This is Thornton v. Thornton," Judge Hargrove said. "A will contest. The adult children of James Thornton are challenging the validity of their father's final will and testament, which leaves his entire estate to his widow, Amber Thornton." He paused. Let the words settle. The word widow landed like a slap. Because Amber had only been a wife on paper for 18 months, but she wore the label like she'd earned it for 63 years. "Before we begin," Judge Hargrove continued, "I want the timeline established for the record." Amber's lawyer stood instantly, performative, polished. "Your Honor, we're prepared to present—" "I didn't ask you to stand, Mr. Pemberton." A ripple of quiet laughter ran through the courtroom. Not at the lawyer, at the fact that someone had finally told Amber's side to sit down. Pemberton sat, smile still on his face, but thinner now. Amber's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. Judge Hargrove turned to Robert. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Hargrove said, "your father was 90 years old when he married the defendant, correct?" Robert rose slowly, like his knees argued with him. "Yes, Your Honor." "And Mrs. Amber Thornton was 32. "Yes." "A 58-year age gap." "Yes." Judge Hargrove wrote something down. "And how long had your father known Mrs. Thornton before they married?" Robert's hands clenched at his sides. 7 months, Your Honor." 7 months, Judge Hargrove repeated, letting it hang. "And what was the nature of their relationship during those 7 months?" Robert swallowed. His voice stayed steady, but it cost him. "She was his private nurse, hired through a home care agency." The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. It breathed in, like the whole room had been waiting for the word, nurse. A whisper cut through the gallery. "Of course." Another voice. "That's disgusting." Amber stood, smooth and practiced, like she'd rehearsed every syllable in front of a mirror. "I was hired as a private nurse, yes," she said softly. "But James and I fell in love, real love. Age doesn't matter when two souls connect." A snort came from somewhere behind Robert. Patricia flinched as if it were aimed at her. Judge Hargrove didn't acknowledge the sound. He didn't have to. He looked at Amber like he'd seen this exact speech 100 times, just with different hair, different perfume, different money. "And you married him 7 months after you were hired?" "Yes, Your Honor. He proposed. I said yes. We were happy." "I'm sure you were," Judge Hargrove replied, neutral as ice. Then he looked at the file again. "Mr. Thornton's previous will, executed 8 years ago, left the estate divided equally among his 3 children, correct?" Helen stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "And the new will, executed 3 weeks before Mr. Thornton's death, left everything to Mrs. Amber Thornton, nothing to the children." "That is correct." Judge Hargrove closed the file, didn't set it down, held it, tapped it once against the bench. The sound was small, but it silenced the room. "And you're arguing this new will is invalid?" "Yes, Your Honor. Undue influence, lack of capacity, fraud." Amber's lawyer stood again, voice coated in civility. "Your Honor, these accusations are baseless and cruel. Mrs. Thornton has endured months of—" "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Hargrove said, "I will tell you when to speak." Pemberton sat. Amber's smile had vanished, and for the first time the room stopped admiring her dress. They started watching her face. Judge Hargrove lifted his eyes and spoke to the whole courtroom. "Let me be clear," Judge Hargrove said. "This court takes elder exploitation seriously. If there is evidence that James Thornton was manipulated, coerced, or deceived in his final days, this will be voided." His gaze returned to Amber. "But if he was of sound mind and made his choice freely, then his wishes will be honored, no matter how unconventional they look." Amber nodded as if she'd just won. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge didn't respond. He opened the file again and turned a page slowly, deliberate. "Let's proceed," he said. And then he asked the question that made the oxygen in the room feel thinner. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, "before you were hired to care for James Thornton, what was your profession?" Amber blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Your profession," he repeated calmly. "What did you do for work?" "I was a nurse." "Where?" "Private facilities, home care, several places." "How many elderly patients did you care for in the 5 years before meeting James Thornton?" Amber hesitated. I'm not sure of the exact number." "Estimate." "Maybe 12, 15? The judge wrote again. "And how many of those were wealthy widowers?" The courtroom went dead silent. Amber's lawyer stood up too fast. "Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance." "The relevance," Judge Hargrove said, voice like glass, "is that I want to know if Mrs. Thornton has a pattern of inserting herself into the lives of elderly men with assets." Amber's cheeks flushed. "That's insulting." "It's a question." Amber swallowed. "James was the only one I ever—" "Ever what, Mrs. Thornton?" the judge pressed, calmly. Amber's voice went smaller. "Ever fell in love with." Judge Hargrove stared at her long enough that her perfect posture finally looked like strain. Then he looked at Helen Vasquez. "Counselor, I assume you have evidence." Helen stood, and for the first time her expression held a quiet satisfaction. "Yes, Your Honor, substantial evidence." The judge nodded once. "Then let's hear it." Amber's hands were shaking now. She clasped them in her lap, trying to hide it. But the courtroom had already seen, and for the first time since she walked in, Amber Thornton looked like she belonged exactly where she was, on trial. Before we continue, a quick note. This story is a fictional dramatization created for storytelling and entertainment. Names, characters, and events are imagined, and any resemblance to real people or real cases is purely coincidental. This is also not legal advice, just a courtroom drama told in a cinematic way. If you enjoy stories where the truth takes its time, where patience matters, and where a final ruling can change everything, please like, subscribe to One Verdict Away, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Your living room, a break at work, or somewhere quiet you're not supposed to be scrolling? Drop your city too. I love seeing how far these stories travel. All right, back to the beginning. Back to the moment this family realized they weren't just grieving a father. They were about to fight for his name. 2 years earlier. James Thornton sat in his study, staring at a chessboard he hadn't touched in days. Not because he didn't know the next move, because moving a piece meant admitting another hour had passed, and hours were all he had left. He was 90 years old. His hands still looked strong, big knuckles, thick fingers, but the strength had turned into something quieter now, less force, more weight. Like the body was still there, but the engine didn't roar the way it used to. Outside the study window, the Thornton estate sprawled across manicured lawns and stone paths and hedges trimmed into perfection. Inside, the house felt hollow. Not empty, hollow. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, the kind that watches you. Eleanor had been gone 2 years. Cancer. 63 years of marriage, and then 1 year of hospital machines, whispered prayers, and his wife fading like a lamp running out of oil. After she died, people brought casseroles and sympathy and soft voices. Then they went back to their lives. And James stayed. In a mansion that suddenly felt like a museum built for someone else's happiness. He turned his head toward a framed photograph on the bookshelf. Eleanor in a garden hat. Eleanor laughing. Eleanor alive. He stared a moment too long. Then his chest tightened in that familiar way, like grief had taken a permanent room inside him and refused to leave. He shifted in his chair and his knee complained. He reached for the edge of the desk, a little tremor. He hid it. He had become good at hiding things. Not money, not power. Weakness. The door creaked open. Mrs. Chen stepped in carrying a tray. 80 years old and still moving like she ran the house rather than cleaned it. Tea. A small plate of toast. Her eyes took in James's posture, his slight slump, the stillness, the fact that he hadn't touched the chessboard. "You didn't eat lunch," she said. James didn't look up. "I wasn't hungry." Mrs. Chen set the tray down without asking permission. She never asked. She pulled the curtains an inch wider, letting daylight push into the room like an unwanted guest. "You fell again," she said. That made James look up. "I didn't fall." Mrs. Chen's face stayed flat. "You slipped. You ended up on the bathroom floor. You called my name. It is called falling." James exhaled. He hated that she was right. He hated even more that she had seen him on the floor. At 90, a man can survive a lot, but dignity becomes fragile. Mrs. Chen poured tea. The sound was calm, a gentle pour, a normal sound in a house that had stopped being normal. "You need help," she said. James's jaw tightened. "I have help." "You have me," Mrs. Chen said. "I am old, my knees are bad, my hands shake. If you fall at night, I sleep. If you stroke at night, I sleep. If you die at night." "Enough," James snapped. Mrs. Chen didn't flinch. "I am not trying to insult you," Mrs. Chen said. "I am trying to keep you alive." James stared at her, then looked away. He didn't want to admit it, but he had been afraid. Not of dying alone. Of becoming the old man in a big house who disappears quietly while the world keeps moving. Mrs. Chen lowered her voice. "Let me call an agency," she said. "Just nights. Someone to make sure you are safe. Someone trained. Someone young enough to hear you if you need help." James rubbed the side of his mouth. Thought about refusing. Thought about pride. Then he remembered the bathroom floor. Cold tile. His voice calling out in the dark. The long stretch of minutes where nobody answered. He nodded once. "Fine." Mrs. Chen didn't smile. She just moved, as if the decision had already been made and she'd been waiting for him to catch up. The agency sent 3 candidates over the next week. The first was a man in his 50s. Efficient. Curt. Smelled like cigarettes even though he claimed he didn't smoke. He walked through the study like he owned it, looked at James like a checklist, and said, "We'll need to install rails in the bathroom." James felt himself go cold. "Next," he said. The second was a woman in her 40s. Nice enough, but she talked. She talked while making tea. She talked while adjusting pillows. She talked while asking James to repeat answers he'd already given. She talked like she was trying to fill the house with sound to drown out the silence. James dismissed her after 2 nights. The third arrived on a Tuesday, 6 p.m. Mrs. Chen opened the front door and froze for half a second, just enough for James, watching from the hallway, to notice. A young woman stood on the doorstep with a tote bag over one shoulder and a clipboard in her hands. Blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, scrubs that somehow looked crisp even after a long day, and a soft smile that looked practiced but not fake. Warm, controlled, like she knew exactly how to enter a room and become the safest thing inside it. "Mr. Thornton?" she asked. Her voice was low, smooth, not loud, not timid. James took a step forward. "I'm James Thornton." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Amber Hayes," she said. "The agency said you needed overnight support. I'm here to help." James looked at her hand. Young, too young. His mind did the math immediately and disliked the answer. "You're—" he started. Amber's smile didn't change. "Younger than you expected?" she finished gently, like she'd heard it 100 times. "I get that a lot, but I've been doing home care for 8 years. I'm licensed, I'm trained, and if you don't feel comfortable, you can tell the agency you want someone else." It was the way she said it. Not defensive, not offended, just offering, like she was giving him control before he even asked for it. James hesitated, then shook her hand. Her grip was gentle but firm, confident, and for a moment, just a moment, James felt his chest loosen. Mrs. Chen watched, her expression unreadable. Amber turned toward her. "Mrs. Chen?" Amber guessed. Mrs. Chen blinked. "Yes?" Amber nodded respectfully, like she understood who really ran this home. "It's nice to meet you," Amber said. "I'll follow your routines. I'm not here to disrupt anything." Mrs. Chen narrowed her eyes slightly. Then she nodded once. Approval, or at least temporary permission. Amber stepped inside. The house swallowed her. And instead of shrinking, Amber seemed to fit. That night she was professional, completely professional. She checked James's medication schedule without acting like he couldn't handle it. She asked permission before moving anything. She didn't hover. She didn't speak too much. She didn't bring pity into the room. At 9:30 she said, "Mr. Thornton, I'll be right outside your bedroom door. If you need anything, you call my name." James stared at her. "Just my name?" he asked, half testing, half mocking. Amber's smile came back. "Well, unless you want a bell," she said. He almost smiled. Almost. Amber left him to sleep. James lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was still quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. There was a shift in the air, a presence, a person. And as ridiculous as it was, James felt safer. Not because she was strong, because she was near. The second week, the routine became familiar. Amber arrived on time, every time. She did her job. No drama, no poor you, no artificial cheer, just competence, warmth, consistency. And in a house where Eleanor was the heartbeat for 60 decades, consistency felt like medicine. One night, James sat in the study after dinner, his cane resting against the chair like a reminder. Amber entered with 2 cups of tea. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the chair across from him. James nodded. She sat, not too close, not too far, just present. Amber glanced at the chessboard. "You play?" she asked. James scoffed. "I used to." "I'm not very good," Amber said, "but I can learn." James watched her. Most caregivers either spoke too little, like they were afraid, or too much, like they were nervous. Amber spoke like she had no fear of the room, like she had been trained not just in medicine, but in loneliness. James shifted his gaze back to the board. "What did you do before this?" he asked. Amber's eyes softened. "My grandmother had Alzheimer's," she said. "I took care of her in college, watched her disappear in small pieces. It changed me." James didn't respond immediately. Then he murmured, "I'm sorry." Amber nodded once. "Thank you." Silence settled, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt shared. Amber lifted her cup slightly. "May I ask you something?" she said. James raised an eyebrow. Amber looked him directly in the eyes, not like a nurse, like a person. "What was your wife like?" she asked. The question hit James in the chest like a hand. He stared. He almost said no, almost shut it down, because talking about Eleanor was like touching a bruise. But Amber didn't push. She waited. James swallowed. Then his voice came out quieter than he intended. "Eleanor," he said. "She was light. She could walk into a room and make it warmer." Amber nodded slowly, listening. "She could also destroy you with one sentence," James added dryly. Amber smiled. "That sounds like a woman who knew her power." James stared at the photo on the shelf, and then somehow the words started coming. He talked about the church dance in 1957, Eleanor's laugh, their first apartment, the nights they ate beans and bread because money was tight and pride was tighter. The first time he landed a major contract and Eleanor cried in the kitchen because she knew they wouldn't lose the house. The way she used to leave the porch light on when he traveled. The way she used to squeeze his hand under the table when he got too arrogant. James spoke for an hour, then 2. Amber didn't interrupt, didn't glance at her phone, didn't look bored. She just listened, like his memories mattered. And when James's voice finally broke, when his eyes watered and he tried to cover it with a cough, Amber didn't pretend not to notice. She simply reached across the table and rested her hand over his. Warm, steady. "No one should have to carry all that alone," she said quietly. James stared at their hands, then whispered, "Thank you." That night, after Amber left his room, James stared at the ceiling again. But this time, he wasn't listening for death. He was listening for life. By the 3rd week, Mrs. Chen started letting Amber handle more of the house. "She doesn't need to," James told her. Mrs. Chen's eyes stayed sharp. "She wants to." And Amber did. Not loudly, not in a look-at-me way, in small things. She organized his medications into a system that made sense. She labeled drawers. She adjusted lighting so he didn't strain his eyes. She bought softer slippers after noticing his feet swelled at night. She started cooking meals that were healthy but still tasted like comfort. And she did something that made James's throat tighten the first time it happened. She laughed at his jokes. Not polite laughter, real laughter, the kind Eleanor used to have. James found himself timing his evenings around Amber's arrival. He hated that. It made him feel weak, dependent, but it also made him feel less dead. One afternoon, Robert visited earlier than usual. He walked into the house, heard Amber's voice from the kitchen, and stopped. His face tightened. He didn't like the sound, not because it was rude, because it was new. New things in a grieving house felt like betrayal. Robert stepped into the kitchen and saw Amber placing a bowl of soup in front of James, smiling softly. James looked content. Robert's eyes narrowed. "Dad," Robert said, forcing a smile, "who's this?" Amber turned politely. "Hello," she said. "I'm Amber. I help Mr. Thornton at night." Robert looked her up and down. Too long, too obvious. Amber's smile stayed calm, but her shoulders went slightly still, like she'd noticed and decided not to react. James saw it. His jaw tightened. "She's taking care of me," James said, "better than you do." It came out sharper than he intended. Robert froze. "Dad," Amber stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Thornton," she said gently, "I can give you both privacy if you'd like." James exhaled. "No, stay." Robert's eyes flickered. He didn't like that. He didn't like her being invited into family space. Patricia called that night. "Robert says you hired a nurse," she said carefully. James's voice hardened. "Her name is Amber." Patricia paused. "Okay. Amber. Dad, is everything okay?" James's grip tightened on the phone. "Everything is fine," he snapped. "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because Robert said—" "Robert hasn't sat with me in this house for more than 20 minutes in months," James said. "But now suddenly he cares who brings me soup." Patricia's voice softened. "Dad, we're worried." "I don't need worry, I need presence." Patricia went quiet. James felt regret immediately, but the loneliness had teeth, and it had been biting for a long time. The next morning he woke with that ache still in his chest. Amber arrived that evening, took one look at him and didn't ask questions. She just moved gently, made tea, placed it beside him, then sat across the room giving him space. After a while, James spoke without looking up. "They think I'm a fool," he said. Amber's voice was soft. "Who?" "My children," James said. "They think I can't make decisions anymore." Amber didn't jump in. She didn't validate too fast. She waited. James tapped his finger on the desk. "I built everything," he said. "I built it, brick by brick. And now they look at me like I'm already gone." Amber nodded slowly. "That must hurt," she said. James's jaw clenched. It did. And then Amber said something that landed like a match in dry grass. "You know what I've learned?" she said quietly. "Most people don't know how to sit with grief. They don't know how to sit with aging. They get scared, and when they get scared, they control what they can." James looked up. Amber's eyes were calm, not manipulative, not dramatic, just understanding. "I'm not here to control you," she said. "I'm here to help you feel safe." James stared at her, and for the first time his loneliness didn't feel like a prison. It felt like something that could be eased. By month 3, James was already in too deep. Not physically, emotionally. He wasn't chasing youth, he was chasing the warmth. He was chasing the feeling of being seen. And Amber was very, very good at being the person who saw him. One evening in the garden, Amber pushed his wheelchair along the stone path. The roses Eleanor planted still bloomed. James stared at them like they were ghosts. Amber leaned down and touched a bloom with careful fingers. "She had beautiful taste," Amber said, softly. James swallowed. "She did," he murmured. Amber looked at him, and in that look James felt something dangerous. Hope. Not the hopeful kind, the desperate kind, the kind that makes old men do reckless things. Amber's hand brushed his, light, almost accidental. James's breath caught. "Amber," he said suddenly. She paused. "Yes?" James looked out at the garden, then back at her. "I don't have time." Amber frowned slightly. "Time for what?" "Time to pretend I'm lonely. Time to pretend I don't want someone here." Amber's eyes softened. James's voice got rough. "Would you consider staying? Not as an employee, as my wife?" Amber blinked. For half a second, the mask almost slipped. Then her expression turned into shock so perfect it looked rehearsed. "James," she whispered. "I'm serious," he said. "I know how it looks. I know the headlines. I don't care." Amber's lips parted. "But your children." "My children," James said, bitterly creeping in, "have been busy." Amber's voice softened. "I never expected this," she whispered. James watched her face. Amber's voice trembled just enough. "But yes. Yes, James, if that's what you want." James exhaled,
like he'd been holding his breath for 2 years. He squeezed her hand, and in that moment he didn't see a scheme, he saw a second chance. And Amber, beautiful, gentle, perfectly placed, smiled at him like she'd been waiting for him to say it.
The children found out 2 days later. Not from James, from a leaked courthouse notice. Robert was in his office when his assistant walked in holding a printout, her face tight with discomfort. "Mr. Thornton, I thought you should see this." Robert took the paper, read it once, then again. Marriage license filed, James Edward Thornton and Amber Hayes. Robert's chair scraped violently as he stood. "That's not possible," he said. His phone was already in his hand. James answered on the third ring. "Dad," Robert said, skipping every greeting he'd ever learned, "tell me this isn't real." Silence. Then James's voice, calm, almost tired. "It's real." Robert closed his eyes. "You married your nurse." "I married the woman I love." "She's 32, Robert snapped. "You're 90. This is humiliating." James's tone hardened. "What's humiliating," he said, "is being 90 years old and treated like I'm already in the ground." "Dad?" "No," James cut in. "You don't get to lecture me now. Where were you when I sat in that house for weeks without hearing another voice?" Robert clenched his jaw. "You think this woman loves you?" he asked quietly. "You think she's not after your money?" "That's enough," James said. "You don't know her." "I know exactly what she is." James's voice went cold. "If you speak about my wife that way again," he said, "you won't be welcome in my home." Robert laughed once, sharp, disbelieving. "You're choosing her over us?" "I'm choosing myself," James replied. The line went dead. Patricia cried when Robert told her. Michael went quiet. Long, heavy quiet. Then he said, "I hope he knows what he's doing." None of them attended the wedding. The ceremony was small, almost deliberately so. A judge, 2 witnesses from the agency. Mrs. Chen stood at the back, arms folded, watching Amber like a hawk watches a field. Amber wore a simple ivory dress, not extravagant, tasteful. The kind of dress that said, "I didn't marry him for spectacle." James wore a tailored suit. He stood straighter than he had in months. When Amber said, "I do," her voice trembled just enough to convince. When James said it, his voice broke completely. Afterward, Amber kissed his cheek and whispered, "I'll take care of you." And James believed her. The humiliation began almost immediately. Tabloids found out within hours. Billionaire marries nurse 58 years younger. Love or gold? Caregiver or con artist? Photos of Amber in scrubs were plastered next to photos of James in a wheelchair. Commentators laughed. Late-night hosts joked. Robert's phone rang non-stop. "Is your dad okay? Is this some kind of dementia thing? Are you cutting him off?" Patricia stopped answering calls altogether. At a charity gala 6 weeks later, an event James had attended for 30 years, Amber walked in beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The room went quiet. Whispers followed them like smoke. "That's her. She's brave. She's shameless. She looks proud." James heard none of it. Amber did. She smiled anyway. When a woman James had known for decades leaned in and said, "My dear, are you sure this is wise?" Amber answered for him. "James knows exactly what he's doing," she said softly. "He always has." James squeezed her hand. Pride warmed his chest. Robert watched from across the room, jaw tight, as Amber accepted sympathy and champagne like she belonged. Later that night, he confronted her. "Enjoying the attention?" he asked, his voice low and sharp.
Amber tilted her head. "I don't understand," she said calmly. "You've turned my father into a joke." "Your father is happy," she said. "That seems to upset you." "What upsets me," Robert snapped, "is watching a stranger erase my mother." Amber's eyes hardened. "I never asked to replace her, but I won't apologize for loving him." Robert leaned closer. "If you hurt him," he said quietly, "I will destroy you." Amber didn't blink. "You should worry about spending more time with him," she replied, "instead of threatening me." She walked away. Robert stood there, fists clenched, watching his father laugh with a woman young enough to be his granddaughter. And for the first time, the thought crossed his mind: what if we've already lost him? The will came next, not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly, like everything else Amber did. James mentioned it over breakfast one morning. "I've been thinking about my affairs," he said, spreading marmalade on toast. Amber paused, just for a fraction of a second, then continued pouring coffee. "That makes sense," she said gently. "You've worked hard for everything you have." James nodded. "I don't want there to be confusion when I'm gone." Amber sat across from him. "No one wants that, especially families." James sighed. "They'll fight. They always do." Amber tilted her head. "Is that what you want?" she asked gently. "Of course not." "Then maybe you should be very clear so no one can twist your wishes later." James stared into his coffee. The seed was planted. 2 days later, he called his longtime attorney, Gerald Frost. 40 years of loyalty. "James," Gerald said carefully when he heard, "I just want to be sure you understand. Changing the will now will cause problems." James smiled faintly. "It already has." Gerald hesitated. "Your children." "My children are grown. They'll survive." Gerald sighed. "Very well," he said, "but I insist on a competency evaluation for your protection." James agreed. Amber smiled when she heard. "I think that's wise. Very wise." 3 weeks later, the will was signed, and 3 weeks after that, James Thornton suffered a massive stroke in his sleep. Amber found him in the morning, cold, still. She screamed, she cried, she held his hand until the paramedics arrived. She wore black at the funeral. She sobbed into her hands while cameras flashed, and the children watched from the front row as their father was buried beside Eleanor. Amber stood alone, a grieving widow, a woman everyone believed or wanted to believe, because the truth hadn't surfaced yet. And the courtroom was still waiting. The will was read on a rainy Thursday morning, the kind of rain that soaked through coats and settled into bones. Gerald Frost's conference room smelled like lemon cleaner and old leather. The walls were lined with framed photos, James Thornton shaking hands with presidents, governors, men who mattered. Now he was gone, and everything he'd built sat in a single envelope. Robert sat stiff-backed at the table, his knuckles pale. Patricia kept her purse in her lap like a shield. Michael stared at the floor, jaw clenched so tight it ached. Amber sat alone across from them. Black dress, pearls, eyes red, but posture flawless. She looked prepared. Gerald cleared his throat. "This is the last will and testament of James Edward Thornton," he began, voice careful. "Executed 3 weeks prior to his death." Amber folded her hands. Gerald read the opening formalities, then the part everyone was waiting for. "To my children, Robert, Patricia, and Michael, I leave my love, my gratitude, and my blessing. But I leave no material inheritance." Patricia gasped. Michael closed his eyes. Robert stared straight ahead.
To my beloved wife, Amber Thornton, I leave the entirety of my estate, real property, corporate holdings, investments, liquid assets, and personal effects." Gerald paused. "The total estimated value of the estate is approximately $3.4 billion. Silence. Then Amber's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. She looked genuinely shocked. Robert didn't believe it for a second. Amber shook her head, tears spilling. "James never told me. I didn't know it would be everything." Gerald avoided everyone's eyes. Robert stood so fast his chair tipped backward. "This is theft." "Robert," Gerald began. "She was his nurse. She isolated him. She manipulated him." Amber looked up, eyes wide. "How dare you?" she whispered. "I loved your father." "You married him for money." Amber stood. "You abandoned him," she said softly. "All of you did." Patricia stood too, trembling. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Amber asked. "Where were you when he fell in the bathroom at night, when he forgot how to tie his shoes, when he cried himself to sleep because your mother was gone?" Michael slammed his hand on the table. "You don't get to rewrite our family." Amber met his gaze. "I didn't," she said. "I showed up when you didn't." Gerald raised his hands. "Please, if you intend to contest the will, this isn't the place." Robert's voice was flat. "We're contesting it." Amber nodded slowly. "I expected that," she said. And for just a second, a smile flickered at the corner of her mouth. The story broke within hours. Children disinherited by nurse-turned-wife. Greedy kids challenge grieving widow. Elder love on trial. Comment sections were brutal. "He was 90. Let the man be happy. They just want money. She earned it. She took care of him." Amber leaned into it. She gave interviews, sat on soft couches under studio lights, spoke gently. James knew what he was doing. He was sharp until the end. The narrative that he was some helpless old man, it's insulting. The host nodded sympathetically. "And the children?" They're hurting. I understand that. But grief can make people cruel." Robert watched the clip in his office, hands shaking. "She's burying us," Patricia said quietly. Helen Vasquez had joined them by then. She watched the screen once, then turned it off. Let her talk. People who talk too much leave footprints. The court date was set, then delayed again. Amber's lawyer filed motion after motion, requests for continuances, claims of harassment, allegations that the children were emotionally abusing a widow. Every delay cost money. Robert refinanced his home. Patricia sold stock meant for retirement. Michael emptied his savings. Meanwhile, Amber hosted charity luncheons in James's name. She wore Eleanor's jewelry, sat in Eleanor's favorite chair, and once she invited the press into the house. "I'm keeping everything just the way James liked it," she said, stroking the arm of the chair. "This was his home." Robert almost threw the television through a window. When the day finally came, the courthouse steps were packed. Cameras, microphones, strangers shouting questions. Amber arrived in a black SUV. She stepped out slowly, elegant, composed, a widow wronged. The children arrived in silence, no smiles, no waves. Inside, the courtroom buzzed. Judge Hargrove took the bench, and the humiliation began. Amber's attorney spoke first. These plaintiffs want to undo a dying man's last wish, Marcus Pemberton said smoothly, because they don't like who he loved. He gestured toward Amber, a devoted wife, a caregiver, a woman who gave comfort in a man's final years. Amber dabbed her eyes. Marcus turned to the children. They visited infrequently. They objected loudly, and now, only now, do they claim concern. Robert clenched his fists. Then Helen stood, and everything changed. But not yet, not today, because Judge Hargrove raised a hand. "I will hear evidence," he said evenly, "but let me be clear." His eyes locked on Amber. "This court has no patience for predators hiding behind grief." Amber's breath caught. The judge continued, "And no patience for families who abandon elders only to return when money is involved." His gaze shifted to the children, "which means both sides should prepare to be examined very carefully." The room went still. Amber swallowed. For the first time since James's death, she looked uncertain, and somewhere beneath the polished grief, a crack began to form. The second week of testimony began with Amber Thornton on the witness stand. She walked to it slowly, deliberately, head bowed, shoulders slightly rounded, the posture of a grieving widow who had been dragged into a fight she never wanted. She wore cream that day, soft, innocent, pearls again. The jury, if there had been one, would have loved her. But this was a bench trial, and Judge Philip Hargrove did not love anyone. Marcus Pemberton stood beside her like a shield. "Mrs. Thornton," he began gently, "can you tell the court how you met James Thornton?" Amber smiled sadly. "I was assigned to him through a private care agency. He'd lost his wife. He was lonely, fragile." She paused. "I was there to help him, nothing more." "And did that change?" "Yes," Amber said softly. "Over time, we became close. He trusted me. He opened up. Eventually, he asked me to marry him." She let her voice crack. "I told him no at first. I thought people would judge us. I thought his children would hate me." She glanced toward Robert. "They already did." Robert didn't move. "And did you ever pressure Mr. Thornton to change his will?" Marcus asked. "Never," Amber said firmly. "I didn't even know he had changed it until after he died." Marcus turned to the judge. "No further questions." Amber folded her hands, waiting. Helen Vasquez stood. She didn't wash. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked closer to the witness stand and opened a thin folder. "Mrs. Thornton," Helen said, calm as a scalpel, "what was your legal name before you married James Thornton?" Amber blinked. "My maiden name was Hayes." Helen tilted her head. "Interesting, because according to state records, your legal name at the time of your marriage was Amber Kessler." Amber froze. Marcus stood. "Objection!" "Overruled," Judge Hargrove said without looking up. "Answer the question." Amber swallowed. "Yes," she said quietly, "that was my legal name." "And why was that?" Helen asked. Amber hesitated. "Because I was married." The courtroom inhaled as one. Helen didn't blink. "Married to whom?" "To Dr. Raymond Kessler." A ripple moved through the gallery. Helen took one step closer. "And Dr. Raymond Kessler is the neuropsychologist who evaluated James Thornton's mental competency before he changed his will, correct?" Amber's lips parted. She looked at Marcus. He didn't meet his eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Helen let the silence stretch. "So, to be clear," she said, turning slightly so her voice carried, "you were married to the doctor who cleared your 90-year-old patient to sign over $3 billion to you?" Amber's face flushed deep red. "I didn't think it was relevant." Judge Hargrove leaned forward.
You didn't think it was relevant, he repeated slowly, that your husband was evaluating your fiancé's mental capacity? Amber's voice shook. No, Your Honor. The judge's expression hardened. Helen continued. How many elderly male patients have you cared for in the last 10 years, Mrs. Kessler? I don't know exactly. Helen nodded. Let me help you. 15. Amber said nothing. And how many of them changed their wills to include you? I don't remember. Helen flipped a page. 4. Marcus stood again. Your Honor. Sit down, Judge Hargrove snapped. Helen continued. And how many of those men died within 6 months of changing their wills? Amber's breath hitched. 3. A murmur spread. Helen pressed. Mrs. Kessler, do you recognize this text message? A screen lit up behind her. The will is signed. Just need to wait now. This one's the jackpot. Amber stared at it. Her hands trembled. Is that your phone number? Helen asked. Yes. Did you send this message to Dr. Raymond Kessler 2 weeks before James Thornton died? Amber's mouth opened, closed.
I invoke my Fifth Amendment right, she said suddenly. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hargrove slammed the gavel. Order! Amber stepped down from the stand. Her legs were unsteady. The image she'd built, fragile widow, misunderstood angel, collapsed in real time. People stared, not with sympathy, with disgust. Helen called her next witness. The plaintiffs called Dr. Raymond Kessler. The doors opened. A balding man in a gray suit walked in. His shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who knew he was finished. Under oath, he lasted less than 10 minutes. Yes, he admitted. Yes, James showed early signs of cognitive decline. Yes, he downplayed them. Yes, Amber asked him to. Why? Helen asked. Dr. Kessler looked at Amber. Because she told me this was our retirement. The judge closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was no mercy left. Judge Hargrove didn't recess. He didn't deliberate overnight. He ruled from the bench. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of undue influence, fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Amber stood. Security stepped closer. The will executed 3 weeks before James Thornton's death is declared invalid. Robert's breath caught. The prior will, dividing the estate equally among his children, is reinstated. Patricia cried openly. Michael covered his face. Amber shook her head. No, please. Judge Hargrove's voice was iron. Mrs. Kessler, you will not profit from this, not 1 cent. He struck the gavel. I am referring this matter to the district attorney. Another strike. Court is adjourned. Amber was escorted out. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just looked small. And for the first time, human. Amber Kessler did not walk out of that courtroom with her head held high. She was escorted, 2 uniformed deputies on either side, close enough that their shoulders brushed hers as they guided her through the aisle, not roughly, not dramatically, just firmly, as if she were already something fragile, already something that needed to be contained. The gallery parted as she passed. No one reached for her, no one whispered encouragement, no sympathetic glances. Her criminal trial was nothing like probate court. No pearls, no soft dresses, no sympathetic lighting. She wore orange. The jury didn't smile at her. They didn't look impressed. They looked offended. Evidence stacked up like bricks. Texts, emails, financial transfers, testimony from other families. Women and men who sat in that same courtroom listening to their loved ones described as investments. One daughter stood and said, "She told my father she loved him. He died 3 months later." Amber stared straight ahead. No tears this time. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, 15 years, no parole. Amber didn't scream, she didn't faint, she simply sat there as the weight of her choices finally landed. Heavy, permanent, unforgiving. The Thornton children established the James and Eleanor Thornton Foundation within 6 months. Its mission was simple: protect the elderly, expose predators, help families fight back. The first grant went to a woman whose father had been manipulated by a caretaker. They won. Robert returned to the steel company. Patricia retired early. Michael paid his daughter's tuition in full. On James's birthday, they planted new roses in the garden Eleanor loved. Still blooming, still alive, still honest. Years later, a reporter asked Robert if he felt satisfied. "Justice isn't satisfying," he said. "It's quiet. It just restores balance." "And Amber?" the reporter asked. Robert paused. "I don't think about her." He looked at the house, at the garden, at the life his parents built honestly. That's the real verdict. And this time, it was final. Phones were raised instead. Cameras caught everything: the tightness of her jaw, the way her eyes darted around the room, the split second when she realized this wasn't just a loss, it was an ending. Outside the courthouse, the press waited like vultures. "Amber, did you manipulate James Thornton? Were you married to the doctor? Is this elder abuse? Do you regret it?" She said nothing. Her lawyer tried to shield her, but Marcus Pemberton looked smaller now, older. The confident man who once strutted through the courthouse no longer existed. Amber was placed into the back of a black SUV. The door shut, and for the first time since she'd entered James Thornton's life, no one was listening to her. By sunset, the news cycle had exploded. Billionaire widow exposed in courtroom scam. Judge voids will after nurse marries patient, hides doctor husband. Elder abuse case sends shockwaves through estate law. Amber's Instagram went dark within hours. Sponsors vanished. Friends deleted comments. Invitations stopped coming. The estate froze every account tied to James Thornton's assets. The credit cards Amber had been using declined. The cars impounded. The house locked. The mansion that once echoed with her heels clicking across marble now stood silent. A notice was taped to the front door: "Vacate within 48 hours." Amber stood there reading it twice, 3 times. She tried the handle anyway. It didn't open. Robert unlocked the front door with a key he hadn't used in nearly 2 years. The house smelled different, not like his childhood, like perfume, expensive, artificial. Patricia walked slowly through the foyer, touching the walls, her fingers trembling. "She changed everything," she whispered. Furniture rearranged, photos gone, Eleanor's presence erased. Michael found his mother's jewelry box empty. Robert went into the study, James's study. The chessboard still sat on the table, but the pieces had been rearranged mid-game. Robert stared at it. He was in the middle of a match, he said quietly. He hated leaving games unfinished. They stood there for a long time, not angry, not triumphant, just hollow. The district attorney moved fast, too fast for Amber to spin. Charges were filed within weeks: elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, bigamy, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Dr. Raymond Kessler took a plea deal: 5 years in federal prison. When asked why he cooperated, he said only one thing: "I didn't think we'd get caught." Amber watched his sentencing on a monitor in a holding room. She said nothing, but her hands shook the entire time.